Hey gang, this is another tutorial on the Marvel Studios logo homework assignment. And what I wanted to focus on here particularly is the 3D movement and lighting. I know that's something some people were struggling with and is a little tricky if this is your first time playing with that. So that's where I want to focus the emphasis. I will quickly go through a couple tips on actually building the 3D stuff out of it, but I do want to point out we already have some tutorials. There's this tutorial on working in 3D space, then this tutorial on the 3D text deboss that I put together, and this is the one that specifically goes through how to combine various 3D shapes. So like in this case where we're trying to cut this text out of this larger box in a 3D world. So I'm not going to go through all those things in super detail. I'm going to go through some pretty quick, but if you want more detail on those, you can go there. There are also in the external tutorial section a couple of other Marvel logo related things. There's how to make a metal 3D logo and get that metallic look on things. Here's a full-on tutorial on how to make the whole Marvel logo, including putting the video clips playing inside the letters and stuff like that. One thing I'll note, this relies on a lot of this being pre-done. It's basically download this preset and you can kind of see how things work and such rather than kind of doing it from scratch. And it requires actually building your 3D objects, not just using the standard extrude objects in After Effects that we've been doing, but actually using Cinema 4D, which is a separate program. There's a license to it built into After Effects, so you have access to it, but it's a whole different working environment that's really designed for 3D modeling and working there. So you can kind of see this. I even put here, I don't recommend you try to actually do the whole project, but you can kind of see how that works. If you're interested in more 3D modeling, there's also a good introductory tutorial here for Cinema 4D. And obviously there's lots of tutorials on that online. This is, I thought, a good sort of 20-minute intro one. But anyway, let's go back here. So I've already sort of taken some time and picked some fonts and kind of put something together here in 2D. And so we'll real quick convert it into 3D. And I do want to show you a couple of tricks and tips related to that. But again, the details are in the 3D deboss thing. So first thing I'm going to do is I have this shape layer. That's the rectangle back here and all the text. It's already been converted into paths and put into here. And I'm going to duplicate this whole layer and say this is going to be Marvel interiors or interior paths, and this is going to be the main block. And the reason for that is there are these things where I have kind of multiple layers of the outside block, and then I have the letter inside, and then for the A and the R I have a kind of third path inside with this little interior part of the A and the interior part of the R. And the way that I'm going to combine my paths, those are not going to show up in the main block. So I'm going to put those into my secondary block here. And I'm actually going to delete everything that I don't need as part of that. So I'm not going to need the M. I'm not going to need the V. I'm not going to need the E. I'm not going to need the L. And I'm not going to need my rectangle for that one. I really just want these interior parts. So this interior part of the A I'll keep. I'll get rid of the exterior part. And the R, I'm going to keep the interior part there and get rid of the exterior part. So if I hide this one for a second, you can see all I'm left with is just these two small bits there. And that's really the only parts that I want to keep in this case. Now let's go back to this main one, and just for simplicity, I'll delete the things that I'm keeping in the other layer so we keep everything nice and simple. Okay, so I've got all these paths here. Let me hide this one for a second. And let's take a look at this. And now what I'm going to have to do is combine all these paths. And as you might remember from the other tutorial, I have to get them all into one object. So right now I have several different content objects in this shape layer. I need to get them all inside one object. So let's go in here and I'll take the M and I'm going to copy its path and paste it into this rectangle. Now, something you'll note that I wanted to point this out because this might happen to you. If you had done any other manipulation with your paths, so I actually kind of stretched some of these letters to get them looking exactly the way I want and the proportions exactly the way I wanted. And when I copied that path, kind of comes back not exactly the way I wanted. So I'm just going to select that M and I'm going to double click on a point here to select all those points and get this box around it. And then move it and kind of re-stretch it to match my original. Okay, and so I'm going to have to do that for each of these. So my A path, let's copy that into the rectangle. Notice the same thing happened again. Double click on one of those points. And stretch that out to get everything right. And I'll just pause this for a second while I do this for the other 4 layers so you don't have to sit and watch through that, but I wanted you to see that's kind of the way you can adjust those there. Okay, so I've got those all laid in how I want now. And so now what I'm going to do within this rectangle is say merge paths. So get all the paths merged, and I'm going to go down here and put them into subtract mode. And so now I've got this block with these other things cut out, which is what I wanted. And I actually don't need these other objects in here anymore, so I'll just delete those off here so it's all into one object at this point. And there's my main block. And so that's the part of the text deboss tutorial going through. And I'm also going to do one other thing while I'm here, because just to be fancy and make sure we do this sort of as fully coolly as we can, is I'm going to go to where I wrote studios here right now. And if you remember in the actual Marvel logo how this happens, if you watch here late in the end, you see that the word studios is kind of being revealed. So when we first kind of set our eyes on it here, it's kind of covered by these black bars, or sorry, these metal bars here. And they're gradually kind of spreading out and revealing it. And that's not something that I'm requiring you to full on execute that for this tutorial. I asked to see if you can, move the bars and make that happen, but actually making it reveal is a little trickier. But let's go ahead and walk through how to do that. So first thing is I'm going to take this text layer and I'm going to convert it into paths, or shapes in this case. Okay, so now I've got these outlines here. Just like with my other path layers, you can see this converted all the individual letters, and each of them has a path associated with it. And the key point here is that these paths are associated with points, and there's curves. It tells it sort of how much to curve around each of these, and then go to this point, and then go to this point. But that's how these are built. So just like anything else, I can keyframe these. So what I'm going to do is, let's make this end up be about 20 seconds. I'm going to think about how I want this to reveal, and I'm just going to kind of reference this. It looks like, when we first see, we're going to just kind of eyeball this. Around 17 seconds into here is when we kind of first come into the letters. So I'll say that's my beginning point. And then around 7 seconds later is kind of when we first start to see that. And Studios is sort of fully revealed by about 11 seconds later if we started at 17. So I'm just going to roughly, again, I'm not trying to mimic this exactly, but let's roughly mimic something like that. I'm going to say by about 15 seconds in, I'm going to have the word Studios fully revealed, and then maybe we'll say about 7 or 8 seconds in is when we first kind of see it and it's sort of half revealed. So I've got these two rectangle objects here, the top line and the bottom line. Those are just rectangle shapes. I'll be able to extrude those fine. And what I'm going to do first is hit P to open up my position keyframing. And so let's say at this 15-second marker right where I'm at is where I want these lines to be here. They've sort of finished their move and ended up there. And let's say somewhere around 7.5-ish seconds. That's going to be kind of where we first see them. So let's go here and say, okay, this one, I know where I want it to end. It's going to end with a position here. I want it to start with its position. I'll hold down shift so I can move it. Let's say right about here towards the middle. Now let's look at this one and say at the same time when we first see it, I want it to be also close to the middle. So they've revealed a little bit. And then when we get to the end, we're there. So now if we imagine what this will look like, these are kind of spreading out and revealing that. Now the other thing we're going to need to do here is actually make the letters get revealed. Because right now these lines are moving, but they're just kind of there next to the letters. Something you would think about that we could do if this was in 2D is use these as the basis for masks, or actually just draw some masks on Studio. That would work. In 2D, the problem is when we go to 3D, those masks are not going to work. They're 2D. They're not going to mask out a 3D object. So just to kind of show you this, plot my word studios here. Let's imagine that I had a mask on here. So I don't even really care what it is. Let's just say mask part of that. And so we're only seeing part of it and part of it's hidden. As soon as I make this a 3D object, that mask no longer functions. It doesn't work in 3D. It's really only for 2D objects. So that's not going to work for us. What we're going to have to do is use these paths and keyframe those so that the paths change and we actually change the shape of the objects. Now there's other ways you can do this in a 3D modeling program, but in After Effects, this is, I think, kind of the most straightforward way. And again, is a way that builds on stuff we already know how to do, which is, I think, an important approach to take when you're first learning visual effects, is thinking of, yes, I always want to learn new things and pick up new techniques, but also how can I use what I already know how to do to achieve what I'm trying to achieve? So in this case, I'm going to just sort of look at this and say like, okay, somewhere around this point, these letters are all still complete, even though they might be masked by the bars here. But then I'm going to want to start shrinking them down. So let's put a keyframe here to say, I know by this point I want these to be kind of all the way where they are currently. So I'm going to go into my path. So if you look in my contents block here, here's the letter S, which has stroke, fill, blah, 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 all this stuff. I can move the whole thing as an object. But I actually want to go to my path, and I'm going to keyframe that. And I'm going to do this for each of these. So go into the path and say, at this point, I want all these keyframes exactly where they are right now. And D, you'll notice, has 2 points or 2 paths because we have the exterior outline and the interior outline. I could merge those if I wanted to, but I don't really care. O is going to be the same, also has 2 paths. And S is the same. Okay, so I got all those keyframed here. Now what I'm going to do is keyframe them to shrink down the object. So let's just move a little bit here. You might think, oh, let me just go here and move all my keyframes here. That's probably not going to work real well. For something like the eye, this would actually work pretty well. But for some of these that have more interesting curves and stuff, it won't. So let's actually look for what are the things we could sort of jump right to this point. And I'm going to go back up here and see where we first start seeing this. Where we first start seeing the bars, and let's kind of set that as our keyframe point here. Okay, so let's start with the eye. That's a obvious one. I'm going to make a keyframe for the path here. And I'm using select and holding it down when I need to shift keyframes. And let's say here, we're only seeing that much of the eye. Then we can check what's happening. You can see it looks like it's being revealed as these go out until it gets to its final point. And that actually looks like that held up pretty good. I do want to scan through this and check, maybe depending on the exact speed things are moving. At one point, we get a little gap between these two where it extends beyond the edge or something, but that actually looks pretty good. I'm fine with that. Let's see if we can do that sort of simple approach for some of these other ones as well. If I look at the U, I can at least do part of that. Let's set a keyframe there. And let's start with, actually, I just want these keyframes here. Let's do the same thing, bring the top down. Let's go to the T and bring the bottom up. And we can try bringing the top down. This is going to be a little trickier because you can see we've got sort of the depth of this T here is not going to all fit. So what I'm going to do is sort of squish it like that. And actually, that's probably gonna not stretch out quite the way I want. Yeah. I have a better idea with this one. So let me keyframe that here. Once that whole bar gets, once the whole top bar of the T gets into here, let me keyframe this top part to have shrunk down to this point. And let's do one more here for safety. Shrink that down even more. Now let's put this whole thing inside here. And now that probably works okay if we want to go back to this point and shrink this back down. Okay, that looks good there. And so you can see what I'm doing. Again, I don't want you to have to wait through this whole thing. So I'm going to pause this for a second while I keyframe the rest of them. But you get the sense of what I'm doing is I'm actually keyframing these paths to match with what's going on with these bars. So ultimately, when these become 3D objects, those objects will expand as those bars move out to look like the bars are revealing the logo. So I'll pause this here for a second while I finish up those. Okay, so I've gotten all those keyframed. Took a while, but the concept is pretty straightforward, even if the execution takes a little work. So you can see that kind of look like it's revealing there. And then the last thing we need to do here is make these all into 3D objects. So I'm going to take top line, bottom line, studio's outline. Actually, don't need this layer. Don't need this one. Don't need this one. Okay, so let's hide all those. Just simplify the composition a little bit. And my main block I want to be 3D. Okay, so I got all these things 3D now. And I'm going to need to extrude them. And I don't really have a good sense of what we're going to want. Let's start with 50 for all of them and just see what that looks like. Can always go back and change these later. Okay, so now we've got these all extruded. Now from this point on, I actually want to move all these things together. So I'm going to take all of these, oops, let's turn on those interior paths too. And I'm going to parent them to a null layer so that as I'm moving things, they are all moving with each other. So let's make a new null object. Let's make that 3D. And then let's set all of these other ones to be parented to the null object. So now if I move the null object around, it's going to move those other things. So you can see if we scale it up, they all scale with it. Let's undo that. If we rotate things, we should be able to see that they're now 3D. You can see that there. Obviously, we don't have any light in here yet, so we're not seeing that, but that's the idea. And this is kind of where we want to end up. So I'm going to set a keyframe here and say, let's have this at that point rotated this way right here. So I'm going to keyframe all those things. That's where I want to end up. And then let's figure out where I want to begin. And I'm going to try to kind of mimic this where we're basically starting inside this R part here. So you see we're kind of like flat looking along the R there. So let's try to create kind of something like that. So I'm going to rotate this. Something like that. 0. Something like that. Just a little bit there. And I want to be a lot closer. So let's bring it, moving on the z-axis, out here. Now, I should point out there's two ways we could do this. I could do this by moving the objects, or I could do it by moving a camera. And I'm showing you moving the objects first, and then maybe we can go back and do it by moving the camera and see what that looks like. So let's get this in here. And need to move it over a little bit. And I'm kind of guessing exactly where the letters are at this point because I don't have my lighting in there, so can't see exactly what it looks like. Okay, so I got something like that. And now as it's moving, you can see it's going back and revealing the way I wanted it to. Okay, so I've got my logo set here and my movement, and you can see this moves through, and we can go through and tweak the movement. So for instance, something we might want to do is smooth out the end here so it sort of tapers off instead of just sort of locking into place. And easy way we can do that is I could right click on here and say easy ease. And I can do that on all of these. And that's going to make it sort of smooth out as it gets to the keyframe. So it's going to travel a little faster at one point and sort of slow down and smooth out as it gets to the keyframe. I could also click on the graph editor here and look at my keyframe and kind of change exactly how that curves. So you see I can actually kind of adjust the smoothness of it. I'm going to do the same thing over here and kind of smooth this out a little bit at the earlier keyframe. Okay. Drop the graph editor. So I got this. What I still need to do is get some lighting in here. Whoops, and I accidentally, the graph editor, moved these points, and I want these to end up at the same frame as this one. So it all sort of smooths out and finishes the move at the same time. Okay. Let's take a look at our lighting, and I think this is the other thing that is a little tough to get used to working in 3D space, and I honestly don't think After Effects has the best visualization of it sometimes. It can be hard to see what you're doing. But let's make a new light. And I'll start with just a spotlight. What I'm going to do is kind of broaden it out some. And let's go with a little less fall off so I can kind of see where things are a little more. Okay, so I got that there. And you can see if I move it sort of side to side, how it's changing there. Something I would actually recommend, I think helps, is working with your view here. So I can go from just one view to seeing multiple views and kind of see different angles on things if this is clear to you. Sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's more confusing. I also like sometimes to just zoom way out so I can see what where my light is and what it's doing. Okay, so I got that kind of spotlight here. Now, one thing that I think is important to note is where that light is. If you look, since we're moving the object, we're going to hit a point where the object, there's my Marvel Studios logo, is not getting any light. And the reason is, if we, let's see if we can see this in different views. If you sort of zoom out at it here, you can see this one, the way the light is aiming, we're actually out in front of it here. So the light is shining this way in this particular view, and our object is out here. So can try to sort of move it back here and get some light on this here. Now, of course, when we get back to the later part of our composition, now it's not where we wanted it to be again. So I could keyframe the light to move. You see where it is here? It's sort of way out, and it's just basically too far away right now, I think is the issue. I could also add another light, and let's actually do that. Let's get a couple lights going in here. Okay, and actually I'm going to get a couple of different lights, and you can see as I get more lights on top of each other, things get more intense. I'm going to get a couple lights that are kind of showing this here. And we got back here, I did have another light that's kind of coming into play. And I can also keyframe these lights. So maybe what I could do here is, let's take this one and say, okay, at the beginning, getting a little bit of light there. And then as this gets farther away, maybe I just want it to move in so it's not so far away. So let's move this down to like 600. And so you can see that light is moving in with this. So you see if I zoom out really far, you can see that light's kind of very far away, and then as we're going forward, it's moving closer to our view. We go back to kind of fit the view and see what's going on here. And you can see, we might need to move the lights around some more because there's points where it is, getting pretty dark, which might not be what we want. It does get kind of nice and bright here at the end. I like that. And we can see maybe if we even at this keyframe, can move this in a little bit, get a little bit brighter on here. And then let's move it in a little faster. I can rotate it. I think I want an X rotation. Yeah, so I can keyframe all these things. It's a little hard to get used to the views, but you can see how you can control all of that. And actually, as it turns out, there's my null object. That very first position, I don't like. We're kind of blocked in by things. Let's see if we can get in a position where we're seeing a little bit more. Try to see exactly where we are. So you can see this takes some play to figure out exactly where you are in 3D space. But to me, I think the key is getting to a place where you can see something and then working it from there. Okay, so I just want to get past this little barrier, then go down here. All right, let's see what that looks like now. Okay, and so you can see here, we end up kind of in a bit of a weird spot, kind of pulling through that blackness there. So maybe I'm going to say, I like this position here. and add a couple more keyframes through. But I know something that some people were getting into trouble with was having problems where things were just kind of jerking all over the place. And you saw what I did is I kind of started with where's my endpoint going to be. Sorry, we're zoomed in a little bit here. Where's my endpoint going to be and where's my start point going to be? And then filling in some keyframes in between to tweak exactly how things work. So something I could do, for instance, if I wanted this to sort of, the start point, let's just move us down just a hair so we're really kind of inside the letter there. Something I could do if, for instance, I wanted this to, you know, maybe start turning a little sooner, is I could say, you know, where I am here, let's just rotate that. What is that, my Z rotation? Let's rotate that just a little bit more by this point than we were. And so we get something like that. And we can keep playing with the lighting, but that's the general idea. One last thing I'd like to do now that I've got all this done is I'll point out I can change some things within these. So within the light, you have some choices about this and the intensity, and you know, I can brighten this up if I wanted a little bit. Within my objects, I have some choices about materials. So, you know, do I want this to cast shadows? Do I want to accept shadows? Yes. Accept light? Yes. You know, how much do I want it to reflect? You know, maybe let's try something like this, a little less sharpness in the reflection. And I could adjust these settings for all the different things. And how I want them to look. Let's get off of this for a second. You know, and how reflective they are and where the lights are and everything. And I can play with all these things. I could play with some other effects, such as things glowing and stuff like that. But this is the basic principle. And in terms of the exercise, what I'm really looking for is just, can you sort of create this and get some sort of movement through it. And then the last thing I'd like to do here is, this all looks pretty good. I'm going to take all these layers and pre-compose this and call this moving Marvel logo. And then I'm going to put a background behind this so it's not just sitting on black. I just want it to be sitting on a little bit of something. I'll just make a new solid and give something a little bit of sort of blue there. Okay. Put that in the back. And now I've got that solid there. This coming in through. Actually, I think that solid's probably a little darker than I would like it to be. So maybe I need to change the color of this. So I've got my solid selected. I can do Command-Shift-Y and go to its properties and change the color. Let's make it pretty dark, just not quite black. And I could also even play with other features of this. So maybe I like that there, but I actually want to kind of just start in black. I don't like this at the beginning. So let's have the first few seconds have this at 0%. 0. So we're just in black, and then kind of as this comes through, we'll just get that little bit of blue fading into the background. And if I wanted, you know, I could keep messing with stuff. I can make a shape here. do a little vignette-y sort of thing, feather this out a ton. More than that. So I got something like that. And I keep playing with other things with this, but you get the idea. So hopefully that is helpful on this. I didn't go through the whole doing it with a camera, but essentially you do the same thing. Let's see if I can do this very quickly. So here's my original thing. Let's duplicate this. Via camera. Okay, so I made moving Marvel logo via camera. Let's open that up and now we can mess with this. Get rid of my lights. Go into my null and I'm going to get rid of all those earlier keyframes so this doesn't move, it just stays where it is. And notice the this Marvel block here looks different because you remember I was messing with the material options on this and I didn't go through and play with them on the other ones. I'll be okay with it just looking a little bit different than those. So let's take a quick look at how to do this with the camera and how that would be different. So I will go ahead and make a new camera. And I can choose my lens length is and such. And just to kind of see how this might affect things, if I go into my camera and let's say Command Shift Y, let's say I went with a super telephoto lens. You see it blows everything way up. And I could move it back in position. Let's actually do that. Back here. So you can kind of see the whole thing. Okay. And you see it kind of is looking kind of dead on at the logo now. And we're not seeing a lot of the sort of shaping and the 3D-ness. If I went to like a very wide angle lens, let's go super extreme. I'm gonna have to obviously go back in closer here. You can see that we're seeing that sort of wider angle distortion. Imagine that it is close on things. So you see that the perspective on the logo changes. So now it's like we're actually very close and you can see over here, we're seeing deep into the sides of that. Whereas here we're kind of looking dead on. That looks different than the telephoto lens did. So I'm going to go back to something that's more normal. Back to 50 is like a normal lens. Okay, so let's say we wanted something like this, and I want this as my endpoint. So let's say, right about here, I want us to get to this point. So I'm going to set that as my position there. And then I'm going to go to the beginning and say, where do I want the camera to start? And I'm going to do very similar kind of thing to what I did on the last one. The difference is, in this case, instead of moving the object around, I'm moving the camera around. So I'm going to say, I actually want to be in a lot closer. And I want to kind of, whoops. I'm going to move. Now, the other thing to note here, and this is where the cameras can get a little tricky, is it has this thing called point of interest. And it's basically going to keep the camera pointed at the same point until I tell it differently. And the point of interest in this case, if you don't know those coordinates, is basically right at the center of where this was. So you'll notice as I change my position, it kind of keeps that center point right in the center of the camera, even as the camera is moving. So, I can rotate things and change it, but it's always sort of, I guess if I start to combine too many of these rotations, it won't do that. But it's trying to keep it looking at that same point. So I find this more difficult to control than moving the object. But we can do it. But I will say for me, it ends up a lot more trial and error. Okay, this isn't quite the same view, but could do something like that. And so the camera is going to pull back here. Oh, and the issue is I forgot to set that I need to keyframe these things as well. And I also forgot, so I just undid a bunch of things. I also need to make sure those are all keyframed at the beginning. That was just me being stupid and forgetting I have to keyframe all of these separately. Then let's go to the end and set these all to 0. So we're back where we ended, and now we've actually got this kind of doing more what we wanted. Not exactly the same move, but you get the principle. Now, something that is a little more convenient with the camera move is, instead of the object move, is once I place my lights, the lights and object are technically staying in the same place the whole time. So I don't have to keep finding where my light is. So let's say I just get a new light in here. And, let's make one more. Let's do that, and let's make this one a little bit brighter. Okay. So those lights are staying there, and if I have this being creating reflections, if I have a reflective surface here, can't even tell what I'm looking at anymore. If I had a reflective surface here, you would see some change as the camera moves, because the way the light would be bouncing off the object and hitting the camera will look different. Anyhow, that's the idea of how you work with the camera. If you are going to work a lot in 3D, I recommend getting good at the camera. It's worth knowing it. If you're just doing this very infrequently, I just think it's much easier to move the object. You get better control, I think, over where it is. And it does make it a little tougher on the lighting. You have to be aware of where these are. You can play with your different view options to see them. You can keyframe your lights and make them move if you need to as well. But I think it's a little easier to keep track of than, I just think some of the camera controls are a little wonky in After Effects. But anyways, those are two different ways you could approach this. I hope for those who were struggling with this, that cleared up some questions you might have had, and we can get something that, nicely sort of moves through space and looks like this. And we've definitely got, if we were going to tweak this more, I would do some work, because I don't like how this sort of hot spot comes on here and it goes to really bright pretty quickly. Instead of something more gradual, I could go in and tweak the light settings. I could go in and tweak my reflection settings and things like that. But I actually do like how that sort of studios bit over there came out. And I'll do a quick render on this and play that so you can see what it looks like. I will pause while we render, because I think this is going to take a little while to do so. Okay, so the render finished. Let's take a quick look. So here it is. Okay, so definitely needs some work. We need to figure out some of the lighting a little better, where those light sources are coming from and moving through, because there's goes through some weird parts here. And you can see what I've done with the text here. You can actually see these things overlapping. So one way to fix this would be make the bars a little deeper than the letters. And I think actually that's how it is in the official Marvel logo. If we look at this, let's see where we start to see that. Yeah, you can see the bars are actually a little bit deeper than the text. So they might have done something similar or did something totally different. I don't know. But at any rate, we got the general principle through here. And just for fun, let's try one more thing. I'm not going to put the video on the sides of all the letters and inside that. As I mentioned at the beginning, that actually requires building the letters in a different way with some polygons. But let's go ahead and get a little bit of video, at least in the background here, of this. So I'm going to go back into my original logo here. And let's bring in some video. I think I have a clip here. I'll just bring in one of the clips that we were using for one of the class exercises you had to do. And I'll throw this in here. It's actually not quite as long as I need, so I'll end up having to duplicate it. But first, let's kind of get this where we want it. Going to shrink this down some. And move it over here. Down a little bit more. Oops. Maybe not quite that much. Probably something like that. Okay, and then let's crop it. So I'll put a mask around it. And really I just want it sort of blocked by this. And the other thing I'll note is it kind of put this right on the sort of plane of the original image, the 0 point. Actually, when I extruded this in depth, that means this could be sort of moved forwards or backwards as well in depth. So if I push it further back, now you're seeing more of that. I can actually get it back far enough that from the angle we're at here, you can see there's a gap. So let's move it back up in there. And I could, of course, actually bring this far enough forward that it actually gets in front of the logo like this, which again I don't want, but my point being this now exists in 3 dimensions. So let's get it back there. That looks good. Move that mask out a little bit just to be sure. And you notice we're actually catching some reflections now on the insides of this because we did make this a reflective material in the actual Marvel logo. All right, so that looks okay. Just sort of random video pick, but it's okay. Looks like I'm going to need a couple copies of this to get through the length of the clip. I could come up with a longer video clip. I could put different things in each letter. I'm just kind of trying to illustrate the point here. And the other thing I'm going to do is I want to take all of these duplicates I just made, and I'm going to parent these to the null because I want them to move with the rest of the logo. And then I'll just sort of spread them throughout the length of this. And so now that should move with the word Marvel, and it in fact does, which is what we wanted. All right, and as long as we're messing with this, let's find that sort of dark spot. Okay, so let's try to solve this dark spot, and I'm just going to put another light in. So I'm going to start by just kind of looking my null object, which remember everything is parented to has moved everything out a lot closer to the screen. So we need to get this out further in front of it so we can see some of that light. Okay, there's something picking up, and you can see what this light is doing is actually kind of hitting inside those letters pretty nicely here. Let's crank it up even a little bit more, get some brightness there. Broaden this out a little bit. Okay, so we added that in, and we can try that and see how it works. And the last thing I'm going to do, now that we've hopefully got a little more light working on this. Uh-oh. Looks like actually my video isn't quite sitting at the right depth I wanted it to be. Let's move these. Whoops, technically I'm on this one, so let's take a look at this one. And just a little bit more. So it's not sticking out behind. What did I end up with? 60. Let's just do that for all three of these. Okay. Okay, so now I've got that video playing behind here, and let's do one more thing, which is as we get to the end of this video, and let's say kind of maybe when we hit about here, I want this video to start fading away, and we're just going to get white through here. And actually maybe what we'll do is actually bring it up so it's not so much in depth, but actually comes a little bit forward and makes this a little more flush. So let's make another new layer. I'm going to make a solid white. It already was white. I'll just make it white for sure. Okay, and I'm going to use the rectangle tool to make it just sort of hit that part there that I want. So now I've got this white solid here. Let's make it a 3D object. I'll hit P so I can see the position on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start it at a depth of 60, which is what the video was at. And let's keyframe it there. And I'm also going to start it at an opacity of 0, so see-through. Keyframe that. And then as we play through here, let's have the opacity go up to 100. And hit P for position. And let's have the position move up to just a little bit of depth. Let's say 12. It's kind of just barely deep there. And so now what's happening is you see the video is going away, and as it's going away, this is also coming forward. So if we look at the M here, you can see we kind of start that deep, and as we go forward, that white is coming forward. We're getting less depth there. Okay, I kind of dig something like that. And last thing, of course, I want to do is parent this layer also to the null layer so that it moves along with. And now let's go back to our finished 3D logo. Uh-oh, looks like I made my white rectangle a little too long on the right side there. So let's grab this mask and just move it in a little bit so it's not quite extending beyond that edge. That should look better. Yes, okay. So let me render this out, and I'll pause this while I do that, and then this will be sort of the final version we'll look at. Okay, so here it is, and what I want you to notice is as this is playing, there's this weird like flickering in the video that I thought at first might be an artifact, and it turns out it is an artifact of sorts, but it's not a render glitch. It's actually in the original video. or I should say it's in the composition. So if you look at this, you can see these sort of weird breakups in the video. Honestly, the details of this is something that's beyond my expertise in After Effects. I don't do a lot of work in 3D, but I can tell you how to fix it. Is what's happening is somehow with this being perfectly flat is the result of this. It's like trying to calculate its curvature and reflections when the video is perfectly flat, when it's a 3D object. So what I'm going to do is go into these layers. So I'll look at this one here. And down here where it says curvature, if I change this to anything other than 0, those glitches will go away. The problem is that I start to curve the image. So if I did, a lot of this, you actually get the image kind of like bowing. You can see it down there, bowing like that. So what I'm going to do is just type in something very small, so it's like a unnoticeable amount of curvature. And I think let's try 0.01% and see if that can solve that. And I think I also have a couple overlapping here. Let's do this one, also make it 0.01%. Oh, and I think the issue here is that I have these two overlapping and they're slightly they're overlapping by one frame, and that was causing that. Make sure there's no overlap here. Okay, now that should be looking okay. The other thing I want to do is, I did notice I get these, I mentioned this earlier, but over here, I can see these sort of weird keyframing from when I made the letters, change size. And so all I want to do is just make the word studios a little shallower than those bars around it. Let's go in here and instead of extruding this 50, let's extrude this like 30. So I extruded that 30, and then I'm just going to move this back a little bit so it's sitting a little bit inside. Those other ones are sitting back a little bit deeper, like so. So you can see now they're sitting a little bit behind there. Okay, so with those fixes, I'm going to re-render this and we'll see if we have success now. Okay, so I got that re-rendered. Let's take a look at the final product. Here we go. Okay, so, the keyframing is still jerky. Like this would need more work. This part here where it kind of like jerks around a little bit, then kind of changes direction, I don't really like. I would go back and change that if we're really trying to polish this up, but certainly good enough for the level of this exercise. And hopefully you can see how all those changes worked. I do like the little reflections in here from the video. That's kind of cool. And this part on the back here where you can see the studios word kind of being revealed worked out very much how we wanted. So that's the way you could go through and do this. There is one last thing I want to show you real quick related to lighting, and I'm not going to go through and re-render this with this and everything, but another option that we hadn't specifically talked about, but that you may find easier in some of these 3D environment things. And this is what's called a point light. So the lights we've been using to this point are all spotlights, meaning the light is placed at a particular position and it's aimed a particular way. So it's shooting only in one specific direction. It's not shooting in the other direction. There's sort of a fall off towards the edges of it. And that can give you some cool effects. That's partly why as we're moving through here, we get these sort of different highlights and different areas being brighter and darker as it goes through, which I think looks kind of cool. But it also means you need to control the light a lot more and be aware of kind of exactly where it is and exactly where it's aiming. So an easier way to deal with some of that is to use point sources. So let me just turn off all these lights for a second. And let's just put a point source in here to kind of show you how that works. So I'll go to new light. Let's make it a point light. See, there's several different kinds here. You're welcome to go in and play around with the different ones we've been using. Spot, we're going to use point here instead. Okay, and you can see it's kind of immediately lighting up the logo there from the middle, and we're getting some fall off because it's in the center of the image right now, and so you're getting a little fall off towards the outskirts, but you don't get that harder edge you did and the quicker fall off we did with some of the spotlights. Now, what is going to happen is as this moves, it's going to eventually move out of the light because it's too far in front of the light at this point. But we can fix that. We're just going to pull this back towards the camera some more. Let's do something like that. Okay. So now it's kind of lighting in there, and you can see some of these areas here are very close to the light source right now. That's why they're getting very bright. And as this moves overall farther away, it's going to get a little bit darker because it's moving farther away from the light. And at this point, it's like totally dark. Can't see anything. So we'd either need to move the light along with it, or maybe, let's make one more point light here that is kind of going to be lighting this up where it ends up. So I'll pull that back a little bit. Let's make it even a little brighter so we get that sort of there at the end. And then now as this is moving, it's close to one light here in the first place, and then it sort of moves into the other place. And it's still going through some darkness. We'd still want to obviously play with this and figure out exactly what we want. That's actually a kind of cool frame right there with just the sort of edges here getting hit hard by the light. But the point is, you can see that this is a lot easier than some of those spotlight sources where we really had to keep track of, and it's not always obvious what direction they're pointed in 3D space. And this way, I don't have to worry about the direction. I just have to worry about where it is, and it's just going to shoot out light in all directions that way. So that can be a little bit easier. So that's another tool for you. I hope this cleared up any issues you had on doing the Marvel logo, and good luck with your own assignment.